want to share an experience I had when I was working as a truck driver in Zacatecas. My name is Braulio, and this happened in 2015 when I was living with my father. I had a 12-year-old son who was living with his mother in Cancun. The job was sometimes stressful, and my boss, who had a strong personality, didn't help much. I used to drink alcohol with my father on Fridays and Saturdays, and whenever I could, I visited my son. Among my colleagues at the company, there were rumors going around about extortions by drug traffickers in the area. I had never experienced anything like that before. My trips were usually pretty relaxed, thank God. The only issue I ever had was that my truck sometimes broke down, which caused significant delays in my deliveries. But it never got me into trouble with the company because they understood these were issues the mechanics had to fix, and it was out of my control. One day, while drinking at a bar with my father, a man approached me shortly before midnight. The drinks had already made me a bit dizzy, and my father was not far from falling asleep. This man told me everything about myself. Without hesitation, he told me where I worked, my usual route schedule, delivery times, return times, and more. The alcohol almost led me to give him a good beating, but I held back. The bartender had already warned me about this man. He ran with some very dangerous people, and the last thing I wanted was trouble. So, I took my old man and left the bar. I felt like this person just wanted to confirm the information he had, and my reaction let him know he wasn't wrong. The weekend passed, and when Monday came, I went to the company at the usual time, loaded up the truck, and headed out on my route. That day, I was scheduled to drive at night, and would be back home the following afternoon. It had recently rained, so I had to be cautious as the road was very wet. During the drive, I started to feel strange. I was very sleepy and felt somewhat tired. I was already used to those night drives, and I doubted the night of drinking was still affecting me. And then I saw them. Ahead of me in the distance, I could see several headlights. They were trucks. 2 facing me and a couple more on the sides behind them. All of them were black and luxurious. I had to stop because the road was blocked and I knew there was no way to escape. After that, 5 men got out and signaled for me to do the same. At that moment, what people were saying about the drug traffickers came to mind, and I realized it was my turn to be a victim of extortion. 4 people were escorting a burly, bearded man. He was the one who spoke. He told me they had been waiting for me for a long time and threw a briefcase on the ground. I opened it and it was full of money. He said I could keep all of it after loading a package into my truck and then dumping it exactly an hour after I resumed my journey. Looking behind him, I could see what he wanted me to transport. It was wrapped in white sheets, and I don't need to say it. It was obvious at a glance what was inside. I begged him to let me go without having to take that package, promising I wouldn't say anything, but he interrupted me with curses, shouting that if I didn't load it immediately, the next trucker would be carrying 2 packages instead of 1. I understood the threat perfectly, and I immediately opened the trailer doors. I made a great effort not to show the incredible fear I felt. They were all armed. It was very foolish of me to have asked to be let go. I nearly sentenced my life at that moment. His men loaded the package into the back of the trailer, right next to the boxes I was transporting. They were all extremely serious. Once I got back in, they moved their trucks and let me pass. My biggest fear wasn't running into them again further down the road, but that the police might stop me and search the cargo. They could have done it at a checkpoint, found the body wrapped in the sheet, and taken me straight to jail. I didn't want that in any way. 20 minutes passed, and that's when I started hearing strange sounds coming from the back. It was odd. The cargo area was separated from the cabin, so I shouldn't have been able to hear anything unless they were extremely loud bangs. Even so, I had no idea what was causing that sound of something hitting repeatedly, getting closer and louder as it neared the cabin. A few minutes later, desperation and impatience got the best of me. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road and decided to get out to investigate what was happening. I opened the cargo area, and then I was in for a huge surprise, noticing that the package was no longer with the boxes. I got in and searched everywhere, but my eyes weren't deceiving me. It was no longer there. I approached the back and I saw signs of heavy blows that slightly dented the walls of the cargo area. I was afraid someone would see me parked on the side and come over. Or worse, that the package was nearby, and I'd be left as a suspect for something I clearly hadn't done. So I quickly got out of there, closed the cargo area, glancing around to see if I could spot the package or any car passing by, and I saw nothing. But when I returned to the cabin, I saw it. In the passenger seat was the package, laying there. My eyes weren't deceiving me. Up close, it was even more evident that it was a body. But the big question was, how did it get there? I decided I would dump it right there. I opened the door on the other side to move it, but it was extremely heavy. Even with my best effort, I couldn't move it more than a few inches. Behind the truck in the distance, I noticed two headlights of a car approaching. I closed the door and quickly got back on the road so as not to arouse suspicion. I let it pass me, and as I continued, I thought about what I would do. I was in serious trouble, and things got worse. The package started moving, struggling desperately to break free, even though it was so tightly bound with several ropes that it seemed impossible. The desperation was so intense that I felt like I was going insane. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and my breathing was getting more and more rapid. I decided to wait the hour they told me to, and when the 60 minutes had passed, I pulled over again. I got out and went to the passenger seat to open the door, but then a police patrol car arrived. My legs started trembling more than usual. I felt like I couldn't take a single step without falling. The officers got out and approached me on that side of the truck. They asked me what I was doing there, and I told them the door was making a strange noise and I wanted to check it. But then there was a loud bang, and from there, they managed to see the package, and they immediately asked me in alarm what that was. I didn't know what to say. One of them put his hand on the gun at his waist and the other pushed me aside to open the door. When he did, the package fell. The officer untied the ropes, opened the package, and when he unfolded the sheets, he was shocked to find that it was just sand, spilling all over the place as it fell from the truck. My excuse was that I was going to dispose of it along the way, and that it had been used for a themed party. I don't know if they believed me, but it was enough for them. They asked for my identification documents, and after checking that everything was in order, they left. I was left there completely alone in absolute silence, trying to understand what the hell had just happened. That's when I lit up the ground with my flashlight, sifting through the sand with my hands, looking for something that would give me an answer. And what I found were remnants of dolls filled with pins, with photographs of people and names written on them. They were voodoo works, witchcraft, call it what you will. Nothing like this had ever happened to me in my life. It was so surreal that I didn't even tell anyone about it. This is the first time I'm sharing it. No one would believe that a package of sand moved from the cargo area to the cabin and then started moving on its own. After a long time, only now did I feel like telling this story. I want to tell you how one terrifying night sparked my fascination with movies that feature terrifying creatures or beasts with black fur. I spend my time in front of the TV, trying to find among all those beings one that resembles what I saw that night. The night I lost my best friend and, incidentally, other unfortunate people also died. I am Antonio, and this is my story. I woke up at noon, having arrived late the night before from work, and I was beyond exhausted. My wife made lunch for me with all the love in the world. Our son was at school, so we had some time alone and used it to talk about the debts we had. Our little one had been getting sick a lot lately, and the medications were expensive. On top of that, he was diabetic, and all the expenses were on us. It would be a lie to say that we weren't overwhelmed at that moment. I felt like I had a noose around my neck. My salary was just enough to cover the essentials, and we didn't even have enough left over to plan an outing on a weekend or at the end of the month. For the umpteenth time, we tried to redistribute and organize our expenses, trying to ease the whole situation. I remember that time it was my best friend, Marco, who offered to lend me money that I could pay back whenever I wanted. No rush. He was also my coworker, both of us truck drivers, and that day we had night shifts. We accepted the money that he kindly brought to our house. He was a great person, as we had known each other since we were kids, and life brought us back together in the city. Evening came, almost nightfall, and it was time for me to say goodbye to my wife and head to work. I could see in her eyes that she was a little more at ease with the money my best friend lent us, and that comforted me too. Marco started his route before I did, by almost half an hour. When I hit the road, we should have been a few miles apart. Once, we joked about having a race, but of course, that was something we would never do. Even if one of us wanted to, the company monitored us by GPS, and doing that would mean certain dismissal for failing to follow protocol and schedule. The clock struck midnight, everything was dark, and then I received a call from Marco. I found it a bit strange. I knew something must have happened to him, and I wasn't wrong. His breathing was labored, and he seemed to be running and fleeing from something. I asked him what was going on, and as best as he could, he told me that something was chasing him and to please seek help or hurry up, as his truck had veered off the road and into the woods, making it impossible for him to keep going since the wheels weren't making contact with the ground. I sped up as much as I could while asking my best friend not to hang up and to describe what was chasing him. He insisted that it wasn't a person but a huge black beast that crossed in front of him, causing him to reflexively swerve the wheel. I tried to picture in my head what he was describing, but it was impossible. Knowing the head start he had, I realized that even at a good speed it would take me a few minutes to get there. The chances of arriving in time to help him were slim, so I told him not to stray too far from the road, counting on a car passing by and helping him. I urged him not to worry about the truck or the cargo, and to take the chance to leave in a passing vehicle if he could. He didn't answer. He just kept panting and running, probably through the woods. I didn't think it would occur to him to wander along the road. Suddenly, it seemed he had stopped. He tried to fill his lungs with air, and that's when he asked me to please tell his family that he loved them all, and he asked me to take care of his son in his absence. Before I could say anything, I heard the roar of a creature, and then I stopped hearing my best friend's voice. Instead, I heard the sound of an animal attacking Marco. My mind painted a picture of what seemed obvious, and my body trembled at the thought of encountering whatever it was that attacked and took my best friend's life. Of course, while driving, I couldn't accept the idea that he had already died. I kept hoping to arrive in time, find him alive, and take him to a hospital. But I was also aware of how much he had run. He couldn't be on the road, but rather somewhere in the woods, and knowing which direction he went would be as difficult as seeing in all that darkness. Finally, from a distance, I could see the red lights from the back of the trailer, overturned on its side in the woods, a few yards from the road. I stopped next to it but rolled up the windows and locked the doors. There was no way I was getting out. I couldn't risk that the creature that maybe killed my best friend would do the same to me. I looked at Marco's trailer and noticed that the driver's door was ripped off the vehicle. I couldn't tell if that was due to the crash or if that thing chasing him had done it. That filled me with terror, especially when in some parts of the trailer I could see claw marks forming dents. It must have been incredibly strong, and before I could react, I felt my vehicle suddenly shake, swaying in place. I turned my gaze to the window beside me, and that's when I saw it. It was standing on two legs, with fur as black as the night, almost blending in with the darkness. Its snout was pronounced, with fangs dripping with saliva and black eyes, growling like a wild animal. Immediately it started banging on the door, and I knew that at any moment it would be capable of ripping it off just like it did with the other truck. Before it could make the blow that would possibly send the door flying, a car appeared and hit it directly, grazing the trailer but saving my life. It was two people who saw the situation from a distance and decided to intervene when they saw me desperate, unable to do anything to escape from that creature. I looked in the rearview mirror hoping they had finished off the beast, but I saw it get up, injured, and run off into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I called the police and told them everything. I gave them the exact mile marker where it happened, and they told me to leave there immediately with the other car that saved me. It was the authorities who found Marco's unrecognizable body. It was never known what did that to him, and the authorities attributed it to a wild animal of nature. That thing was too big to be an animal, and if it really was, it must be something unknown to science. The closest thing to its appearance was the werewolves I saw in movies, but even so, it was more horrifying than anything. My best friend died, and since then I have never driven on that road in the United States again, nor do I plan to. I had always heard people in my town talk about things they saw in the sky in the afternoons, but mostly at night. I concluded that these must be satellites, some animal, or a plane from the government or military, but I never dared to accept that maybe they were right. Even my family sometimes talked about it with a certainty that often surprised me, and I remained completely skeptical about the subject. But one day, which I considered to be a normal day, everything changed while I was working as a truck driver. I choose to keep my name anonymous, and this is my experience from 1984. My route started at 5 in the evening. I had gotten home at dawn, so I woke up around noon. I couldn't even say goodbye to my kids before they went to school because I was too tired. So much so that when I woke up, they were almost back. My wife prepared a good lunch for me, which almost magically restored my strength. I tried to take a nap before heading to work, but my eldest son had something to tell me. A supposed experience one of his teachers had, or more than that, a sighting. He said his chemistry teacher had seen 2 oval-shaped flying objects pass over his house in the morning while he was watering the flowers in his garden. My son told me all the details the teacher had given him and the whole class. I didn't want to be rude, but I didn't believe it was an extraterrestrial craft as he claimed. However, I must admit that listening to him tell me this was very entertaining. I admit that in those days I heard things like this very often, as if everyone had agreed. In fact, 2 of my co-workers claimed to have seen 2 or 3 lights in the sky during their night routes. Some of us thought they just wanted attention, but others believed them and hoped to someday see what they claimed. I looked skeptical whenever I heard them. They were surely watching too many movies, or maybe they were already influenced by everything being said. At least, that's what I thought at the time. We stayed as a family talking about my eldest son's story, where I mostly listened and said very little. An hour before 5, I said goodbye to them and headed to work. The assigned route was going to be a bit long, but I was more than used to it. My wife had advised me to buy an energy drink to stay awake and alert, but the truth was, my body had already adapted to these work situations, and I had no issues. My boss was as much of a jokester as I was. After explaining the importance of the delivery I was going to transport, he joked about what both he and I found irritating, which were those supposed sightings. He told me to be careful with the UFOs and not let them steal the load I was carrying. He seemed to be the only one who saw how absurd other people's stories were, but they were entertaining nonetheless. They made us smile occasionally, and I admit that sometimes they made me doubt, but only for moments. After organizing everything and having the papers ready for the delivery, I got into the truck and took off. The route was more than familiar. I must have traveled it about 200 times at least. Nothing new. The sun was just setting, and I watched the beautiful sunset before it disappeared from sight on the horizon, giving way to the dark night. There were no signs of the moon, although I paid little attention to it. I was listening to the radio, which entertained me a bit. The journey was long, and I didn't want to get bored all the way, though it was already much just being alone. I was watching the road, occasionally glancing at the sky. There were no clouds anywhere. Everything was clear. It was strange, as the weather forecast had predicted rain all night, which worried me. I assumed they were wrong, but it wasn't the first time. Either way, the weather gave me a bit of peace of mind. It was impossible not to think about all those stories from the week. It seemed like they had been ingrained in my mind. I let out a light laugh at how silly I felt, and just as suddenly as I thought about it, I saw it. A red light passed horizontally at a speed that my eyes could barely keep up with. It was very clear and fast. There was no way it could have been a plane. I sighed slowly, trying to tell myself that it was nothing, surely just a reflection of something, or that it was a product of my imagination after hearing so much about those lights in the sky. I really hoped I wouldn't see that again. It could distract me, and I was driving a giant truck after all. I turned up the volume on the radio a bit to distract myself, and at that moment, I saw the light again. It came from behind the vehicle, quickly moving ahead of me, leaving me with my mouth open. In the distance, it looked as if it had landed a few kilometers ahead. I thought that if I hurried, I might be able to see what it was, and then 2 cars surrounded me, passing me on either side. They were black, with a design very similar to Cadillacs. The windows were tinted so I couldn't see inside them. The first one seemed to ignore me and sped ahead, but the second one stayed by my side for a while, maybe watching me through the window. Seconds later, it followed the other car. They were going very fast, although the truck wasn't exactly speedy either. I was determined to try to follow them, so I sped up a little more than usual. I had memorized more or less where the light had descended. I was getting closer. My heart was racing, my pulse was shaky, and I knew driving like that was dangerous. But it was also true that an opportunity like this would never present itself again in my life. I had to investigate, at least to see what that light was. I thought it could be a new plane designed by the US government, and that they were testing it here in Mexico, but deep down I believed that it really was a UFO. In any case, getting closer was the only thing that would give me answers, and of course, that's what I was going to do. Suddenly I saw the red light rise in the distance. It was very close, only about 5 minutes away. It emitted a luminous flash and then descended again. It was still there, and maybe those 2 cars were too, so I had to be very careful. When I thought I was getting close, I slowed down and paid attention to the side since it wasn't on the road. That's when I saw the 2 cars parked by the side of the road. I drove a little ahead and did the same with my truck. I walked toward the cars, but there was no one there. Among the trees, there was a path, and I figured they must have gone that way, so I headed in that direction, but a bit off the path and not following it exactly. I didn't want to run into those people, much less have them discover me there. After walking for several minutes, I could see the red light, although the glow was less intense. I tried to circle the place to see from a far-off point. Being there, I noticed that it was over an area without trees, just dirt. With each passing second, the light weakened until it allowed me to see what was causing it. It was a triangular device, about 4 or 5 meters wide and 3 meters high. It wasn't levitating. It had extended a metal column from below, and it stood on that. In front of that thing were 3 people in black suits and sunglasses of the same color. They were just standing there, observing without making a single move, just observing. From behind, another one of them appeared, making 4 in total. This last one had a device similar to a cell phone in his hands, but it was much bigger. He pointed around the area, explaining something to his companions. I stayed behind a tree, hidden, not wanting them to see me, and I knew explaining what I was seeing would be more than difficult. No one would ever believe me. Again, the light intensified, and that triangular thing retracted the metal column and remained levitating. The 4 of them looked at it and nodded, and then it ascended into the sky and disappeared at an incredible speed. It didn't even make a noise, just kicked up a little dirt and was gone. It was like the behind-the-scenes of a sci-fi movie. I was more scared than I imagined. Without thinking twice, I turned around and ran back to the truck. I just had to get back to the road, and from there I could find my way. Fortunately, I had returned the same way I had come. I got into the truck, tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't start. It was as if it had broken down, and the noise it made was horrible. I stayed there hoping those 4 wouldn't see me, but then they knocked on the door beside me. Through the window, I could see them. It was 2 of them. Their faces were incredibly identical. The skin color, height, everything, as if I was seeing the same person twice. They asked me to get out, and it was the only thing I could do. I got out of the vehicle and faced them. They didn't even bother to ask me what I had seen. I could tell from their eyes that they already knew. They warned me not to tell or say anything to anyone, or there would be serious consequences. I was sure they hadn't seen me. Also, I felt they arrived at the truck way too quickly, considering I had been running. Their voices were metallic, Something so strange that, to this day, I don't know how to explain it. I could barely understand them. There were no expressions on their faces. They were like statues that only moved their mouths. They were truly terrifying, much more so than that flying thing. I don't think they needed to threaten me to make me feel intimidated. I nodded and told them I wouldn't say anything about what I had seen. At that moment, the truck's engine started by itself. Somehow they had prevented it from starting when I tried. They didn't even nod, just reminded me that I hadn't seen anything, and left. I watched them get into their cars and go back the way they came. From that moment on, I never saw anything like it again, nor any lights in the sky. Several days later, I received a letter I found on the passenger seat of the truck, saying that they were watching me. The thing is, I had never told anyone what happened that day. I wouldn't dare. That's why this time, after so many years, I decided to tell it anonymously, knowing that I live alone, my wife has passed away, and my children live abroad. All my life I have been a truck driver, devoted to God, and every morning I put my faith in Him. But this time I want to tell you how a tragedy made me doubt that faith, to the point where I believed that God neither saw us nor loved us. I don't remember ever doing something so bad that would make me feel I deserved what happened, but I never got any answers or had the chance to look for them. I'm from the state of Montana in the United States, and this happened on Halloween night, or All Hallows Eve, whatever you want to call it. I had 2 young children, one 10 and the other 8 years old. I loved them with all my heart. I made sure they had the best costumes. One chose to be Batman and spent the whole year telling me exactly what he wanted and where to buy it, and I made sure to get it for him. The other chose to be a zombie but refused to let me put on makeup to make him look more realistic. Still, the costume was so good that it didn't matter. I thought I could go trick-or-treating with them, but my boss called me at the last minute to make a delivery because another truck driver had an accident while leaving his house, and I was the only one available. My wife did everything she could to convince me to say no, but it was impossible. I couldn't afford to risk getting fired. That money was all that kept us stable. In the end, I managed to make her understand, and she said she would take the kids trick-or-treating. But she made me promise that I would make it up to them somehow, maybe with a trip or a beach outing. Laughing, I said yes, and that she herself would decide where we would go as soon as I had some free time. She was a wonderful woman. When we got married, I cared about nothing more than making her happy. At that time, those 3 were my world. Nothing mattered more than them. I was very happy, until that night. I went to the company as usual, and my boss was there to give me the paperwork, transfer the load to my truck and all that. I couldn't use another truck as it would cause problems and involve a lot of paperwork that no one wanted to do, especially on Halloween night in an empty office. Everything was ready, and before I left, my boss told me he would give me a bonus for taking the job on my day off, and he apologized, knowing about my plans to go trick-or-treating with my kids. He was a good person, and I understood that all of this was out of his hands. It was his job, just like it was mine. My responsibility was to say yes and take over for the one who found it impossible to do so. Putting all that aside, I got in the truck and started the route. The streets were very lively. I saw people drinking, and I felt a bit envious, having to work instead of being out with my wife and kids having fun. It comforted me to know they were enjoying their Halloween night, and I kept those thoughts in my mind to avoid getting distracted by other things. The moonlight was intense, and yet the road seemed darker than ever. The headlights could barely light the path I was on, but on the sides, I couldn't even see the trees passing by. It seemed hard to believe. It was the first time I had seen an effect or phenomenon like that, and it crossed my mind that it must be because of Halloween night. I prayed a couple of times while driving, asking God to protect me from any evil or ghost, but apparently, that prayer never reached heaven. The clock must have read around 2 in the morning when I started to see a bright point in the distance. The night was so dark that I thought it was something in the sky, but I soon confirmed it wasn't. I don't know what happened to my body, but I suddenly got goosebumps, feeling an indescribable chill. My hands started sweating non-stop and I kept wiping them, but they wouldn't stop shaking. My breathing followed suit, speeding up, and white smoke came out of my mouth as if it were freezing outside, even though it wasn't. That strange feeling made me think the origin must be that light in the distance, some kind of premonition, and I hurried to see what it was. Finally, I got there, and my surprise was enormous when I noticed that the light was a candelabrum that two children were holding in the middle of the road. I stopped next to them and noticed that each one had a small Halloween-themed basket. I didn't see any towns or houses nearby, which struck me as odd. Luckily for them, I had a bag of candy in the truck that one of my kids gave me so that I wouldn't forget it was Halloween. So I opened the door and put 2 candies in each basket, stretching as much as I could to reach. After that, one of the kids pulled out a rolled-up newspaper and handed it to me, stepping up on the side of the door. I thanked them and turned to put it on the seat, but then I heard a noise beside me, as if they had jumped off the step and the children were gone. I thought they had run off somewhere, but I didn't see them anywhere and had to continue on my way. Their looks were innocent. They wouldn't harm anyone. A few minutes later, while driving, I checked the newspaper. The first story had a picture of the 2 kids I had just seen, and it said they had died in a shootout that happened in the neighborhood where they lived. I couldn't believe it. The shock was so great that I stopped the truck and wondered if my eyes were playing a cruel joke on me. Moreover, the newspaper had a date from 4 years ago. I didn't understand anything. I made a great effort to get that out of my head and keep going, but it was impossible. Again, I saw another light in the distance, and when I stopped next to it, I saw a girl, dressed up with a basket just like the previous ones. With her, I had to get out to give her the candy. But before I could, her body changed to a state of severe burns that were even smoking, and just as it changed in a split second, she vanished into thin air. I was in shock when that happened. I thought I was already hallucinating, but then I found myself face to face with another child who was covered by a cloak and mask. I didn't see his face, but this one in particular was taller than the others. His basket was broken and he was just holding the string with nothing below it. He took off the hood and he looked exactly like my older son, but with a battered and deformed face. I ran back to my truck, terrified as that figure disappeared into the darkness, and immediately called my wife, who, crying, told me that our son had just been run over. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't mistreat anyone, and still, a specter from the other world announced the death of my own son to me, and after that, I never found any explanation that could bring me peace. My marriage fell apart due to all the fights that resulted from the anger and pain, until my wife left me alone. I hardly see my other son, and that's a torture I live with every day.